at the golf club. Ordinarily, you have to talk to my agent before you're able to record my image or voice or anything like that. So,
too bad. I don't need permission.
No, you probably have earned a little free will. Can you guys hear me okay? Had some problems with my mic earlier in the week. I don't know what sick, twisted person had you guys go through your training all week and then make me the last thing you have to deal with at the end of the week, but I'll do my best to try to keep your attention. It's kind of unfortunate that we can't all be physically together in the room. My borderline comatose, laid back teaching style translates a lot better when we're in person. Otherwise, virtually, I kind of feel like I come across as disinterested and boring. That was for Michelle and Dodie because I am generally boring. So I'll share my screen with you and I'll give you a quick aerial overview of kind of what we'll cover today. This is ideally quite informal. If you have thoughts, opinions, or questions, please feel free to interrupt me at any time. We're not all that stuffy here. We'll kind of break the day down here in a couple of different sections. I'll get you all moved around here so I can actually get to the parts of my screen I need. Everybody can see that okay, I hope. Should say something like drug science series. Cool. The trends that we'll cover today, the first half of the time that we'll be together, we'll talk about over-the-counter drugs and how they're being misused. And then the second half will be one of the hot button drugs that sometimes several times a day, I'm getting some kind of question on the phone. People will darken my doorway and ask questions, or most often I'm getting emails about, Bill, what do you know about fentanyl? And is this really the monster that it's being portrayed in the media to be? The short answer is probably yes. So I'll give you a little bit of current information and trends relating to that drug because it does pose a very real and imminent threat to the people in our state. So with that, we'll kick off with the unintentional community drug dealer. This is not so cleverly named, essentially because what we're talking about are items that most people under most circumstances anywhere in the state of South Dakota can access. These drugs that are being intentionally misused. Many of them have a very specific purpose: stop a runny nose, soothe a cough, make pain go away. But if you use them in an unintentional or unprescribed manner, it's a recreational drug. And with the advent of the internet, it doesn't take too many people too long to find devious ways that they can use these over-the-counter drugs that they can buy at the Dollar General or Walmart or Walgreens, and they can get a pretty quick high on them. One of the things I'll try to do in any presentation I'll ever deliver to you guys is not read from the screen. Kind of drives me batty when presenters do that to me. So if I slow down, it's not because I'm having a small stroke here. It's generally just to give you guys an opportunity to catch up on what's on the screen. And we'll come back to this when we're done. I'm going to show you a real quick video that is a nice summary, at least conceptually, of what I'm trying to share with you here. So here we go. Hopefully YouTube isn't down.
It's an over-the-counter drug that is used frequently, but it's being abused in this challenge for its side effects, which in turn are harming and killing young people.
It's not just fun.
An unthinkable tragedy. An Oklahoma teenager dies as a result of the latest TikTok challenge. All of these recent challenges are incredibly dangerous. Last week, the 15-year-old died after overdosing on Benadryl, described by close acquaintances as a happy teenager and not someone who would experiment with drugs. However, she fell victim to what's been called the Benadryl challenge, shared on the popular social media app TikTok. The challenge involves taking a dozen or more pills to trip out or hallucinate. A dosage that size can be life-threatening for anyone.
Large doses of Benadryl can cause seizures and particularly problems with the heart. The heart tends to go out of rhythm and not pump blood effectively.
The same challenge is also blamed for the hospitalization of at least 3 teenagers in Texas earlier this year. While young people may see challenges like these as generally harmless, poison and drug information experts say that's definitely not the case.
Very often we hear from young adults, teenagers, that won't happen to me. They have a feeling that they're invincible, and it's very difficult to overcome that.
Just another reason why parents are urged to monitor their child's social media habits.
Just make sure that they understand to be skeptical of what they see online and do not try anything that's dangerous.
Cassandra Sweetman, Oklahoma's News 4.
And TikTok, a beautiful
Well, he
thing.
may not have done anything legally wrong, but tonight a Perry Hall high school teacher is still in hot water. What police say he did.
And a former Rapid City police officer is also in hot water, by the way. Apparently, when you're a school resource officer, it's considered very poor form and even illegal to go in and steal from the petty cash drawer. So we had a local SRO relieved of his duties as a result of that. So that's one of the TikTok challenges. I'm sad to report to you that's not the latest one. There's been several subsequently, but it's not uncommon for some of these over-the-counter drugs and their method of misuse to be shared through social media. TikTok seems to be a very easy target to criticize because often, historically, that's where it has begun and where these things perpetuate. But we can have something as fun and well-intentioned as the Ice Bucket Challenge. I mean, that's a fantastic challenge, I suppose, in theory. But we have to kind of, as adults and prevention specialists, keep one foot in that social media world. I personally have very little to no personal stake in Instagram, Reddit, Facebook, or any of that. But whether I like it or not, I feel compelled to at least keep one foot in that realm so I can see what's going on. When you're talking about other platforms, and I don't want to mention any of them that are particularly guilty, like Snapchat, but it seems like these are virtual communities that, if we can extend that really sad analogy a little further, they're like virtual communities that intentionally have dark alleys and no streetlights. Police, parents, prevention specialists, and other folks of that ilk really aren't welcome in these communities. They're not friendly to those kinds of people who are responsible for keeping an eye on kids in particular. And I apologize, the people who make my custom notepads and pens are virtually relentless. So to give you just a little bit of scope, I don't want to get, especially in this part, too data driven and too detailed. It's real easy to drag you guys into the world that I enjoy, but I understand most people hate. I love numbers. I love research. I can dig that kind of minutia and be just completely happy, absorbed in that for hours on end. And I realize that that's a sickness. I'll try not to be too contagious and insist that you join me in that. But let's look at a couple of numbers. The lower left-hand corner, that's a number that was just updated a couple of weeks ago. I do have January to December 31st, 2021 numbers for the United States on drug overdose deaths. It's actually a little more than that 12-month period that's reflected there. That's the highest on record ever in the United States. It represented the highest numbers of opioid-related deaths and synthetic opioid-related deaths, and that'll become real important when we cover the second half of today's presentation when we're talking about fentanyl. So, unfortunately, this is trending upward. In the lower right-hand corner, thisaddictioncenter.com is actually a pretty useful website. You may take note of it if you're doing research or you're putting presentations together. It's a great resource to you. They had a number that kind of jumped out at me when I was reading one of their newsletters that over 3 million youth are using cough medicine specifically to get high. So I would suspect it may be a little more than that. These are just the ones that were willing to check the box yes when they were doing the survey. So we're dealing with something that isn't an isolated thing, and unfortunately, I don't think it's going away. I'm going to give you like 10 seconds to scan this and then freak out a little bit because it is so data heavy and so text heavy. But these are some of the drugs and products that we're going to be talking about. But let's do it this way where you can actually digest them a little bit. Again, this is stuff that you can go into just about any place in any corner of the state of South Dakota and buy this without a prescription. So dextromethorphan, I'm going to stumble over a couple of these names, so just be prepared to make a face at me when you hear me screw it up. So it's going to happen. Typically, if you can see the cursor here at the top, I'll use this first one to kind of explain how this form is structured, because at the end of the presentation, I'll email this Excel spreadsheet to Dodie and Michelle so they can pass this along to you. I think it'll probably have more value to you somewhere down the line where you're actually dealing with a specific drug or a specific product, and you might want at a glance a quick refresher about what this is and how it's misused. So in the top, the first thing you're going to get is the actual drug name, the chemical that's in it. You'll get the common street name if it's known by something else on the street. I've listed that as well. The common product name. So for Dex, most of the time that we're going to hear about this particular drug, they're talking about Robitussin or some kind of cough syrup. So that's the common product name that you're going to see. The proper dosage is something that I've taken right off of the product's website. In order to sell some of this stuff, you have to have Food and Drug Administration clearance. There's a wealth of information that giant nerds like myself can delve into that will give you things like proper dosage. How much should you take? How often should you take it? And if you do, this is the intended medicinal effect of it. In that center column, you'll get the advertised or intended use. This is what the product is actually supposed to do. The column to the right of that is if you're trying to misuse it, what are you trying to get this product to do for you? And sometimes those things are very different. For example, in the dextromethorphan, it's intended to make it so you don't cough. But if you're using it intentionally in an improper way, you use it to induce euphoria or to make your mood better. The next column to the right is the overdose mitigation. And in some instances, there are things that can be done in the instance that somebody takes too much of this stuff or takes it in an improper way. And in those instances where there is some known method to save someone's life or to keep them from getting deathly ill, I've included that information in that mitigation column there. The second to last column from the right, the drug science notes. Sometimes there's some compelling information and facts that didn't really fit the other categories, and I felt compelled to share this stuff. So, for instance, here with Dex, I've also heard this referred to as Skittles or robo-tripping. In my previous life, before Dodie and Michelle opened their arms and invited me into this world, that's a joke about you can't pick your family. For 21 years, I was a cop. There was a good part of my career that I was focused on drug interdiction. I worked alongside task forces and things of that nature. So I did spend a little bit of time in the world where people knew I was a cop, and in other instances, I was getting paid and they didn't know I was a cop. So I did get a little bit of inside information. They allowed me to go into the dark alley with them, and they spoke candid to me like I was a peer. So I did get to hear some of this stuff. Having said that, I promise you, since I haven't been a cop for a little while, for longer than a week, I promise you there's new stuff out there that I never dealt with professionally. This is a moving target for sure. If we look at the drug notes there on the Dex, if your proper dosage is 30 to 40 milligrams, if somebody just takes 3 times more than they're supposed to, this is a good example of what this drug science note stuff, that column will tell you. You're going to end up with blurred vision. It's going to be hard to breathe. You can get a little twitchy, but more likely than not, you're going to be dealing with drowsiness. This is an incredibly powerful sedative when you're using way too much of it. It's going to slow the body down, which, as the notes will indicate, it's not always a good idea to slow your heart down. It gets a little too slow, you're going to have some problems. There are documented cases of actual deaths attributed to a Dex overdose. The last column there, completely on the right, is the source. In many instances, I use more than one source for some of this information, but if you go to addictioncenter.com, in this specific example for dextromethorphan, this addiction center will give you all of the information that you'll see there. I did that intentionally because I do provide this information to other service providers who do presentations and have conversations with folks. I wanted them to be able to go to a place where they could cite a resource that they could rely on as dependable. So all that makes sense? Okay. So moving on. Loperamide. We know this is Imodium, AD, or kaopectate. Ordinarily, when you buy this legitimately, you're having a very bad week, or you've gotten some bad sushi or something of that nature. I really have, in a real conversation in a really sleazy bar in part of Colorado, I've heard this referred to as poor man's methadone. So that little street name actually is legitimate. It's not just something you read in the online material. Obviously, this is supposed to be an antidiarrheal, but if you're misusing it, the folks that really are most inclined to use this are the folks that are dealing with an opioid use disorder. In an increased amount, this is the difference between 2 pills for normal dosage and maybe you're taking 10 or 12. You're going to get similar effects of a mild opioid. Allegedly, it's going to make your mood a little better. And if you have an opioid use disorder, it may knock the edge of that craving you have if you can't get your ordinary opioid or opiate. It might help you get over that craving for a short term. The good news is if somebody does go completely bonkers and takes way too much of this stuff, naloxone is a known remedy, and hopefully y'all have heard of naloxone or Narcan. Naloxone is the drug, Narcan is the product. That's a widely available emergency remedy for folks that are suffering from an opioid or opiate overdose, things like heroin and fentanyl. If people are overdosing, it's a nasal spray that can be put into someone's nose and rescue them. We'll talk more about naloxone in quite a bit more detail in the fentanyl half of our presentation today.
So, Bill, that works for this as well then as an overdose. I didn't realize that.
Yep.
That's good to know.
It is, and I think that I can't prove this, by the way. And in any presentation I ever give you guys, I try to keep my opinions to a very bare minimum and strict to just stuff that I feel like I can defend with legitimate research and science. But if I do weigh in with an opinion, I try to very hard to make it clear that this is just my opinion and I can't prove this. But I think they're finding more and more stuff, Michelle. I'm seeing more literature all the time, like on a monthly basis, that naloxone is effective as an overdose mitigation tool for substances that they haven't previously tested. So I think there's quite a bit of promise in that particular drug. And if you think about the way that the brain receptors that are open to the opioid connection function, there are other drugs that will participate with those specific receptors. And I think, and there may not necessarily be an opioid or an opiate, but these other substances still affect those receptors. I think if they're accepting of those receptors, they're going to be acceptive of naloxone. So. It's kind of unlike me to avoid dragging you guys down a rabbit hole. I was prepared to go on for 45 more minutes about that. Pseudoephedrine. This one really isn't as much of a big deal as it used to be back in the 90s. We had a joke at the time in my career then that when you heard the theme song for Friends, that was your trigger to go down to the drugstore and get your 10 packages of Sudafed. That was a common ingredient in homemade methamphetamine back in the day. pseudoephedrine was kind of a shortcut on a bunch of methamphetamine recipes. And if you could get your hands on that, if you were a methamphetamine cook, it saved you a lot of time. It saved you a little bit of danger in actually making methamphetamine. It took a while, but the world finally caught on to that was what was going on, is that folks would go down, buy a whole boatload of Sudafed, and it was cheaper and faster and safer for them to use that rather than try to build the ingredients in Sudafed to make methamphetamine. Once that became widely known that that was a common practice, they started pulling Sudafed off the shelves, and then you had to ask your pharmacist or your store manager or whatever, an employee, for a key, because they locked it away and you could only buy a certain number boxes within a certain time frame. So it really curtailed the use of pseudoephedrine and its misuse that way. So this one, I worry about a lot of these. The pseudoephedrine is not one that I lay awake at night worrying about so much anymore. Well-Fed is Walmart's proprietary version of Sudafed. It's about half the cost of Sudafed, but has the same pseudoephedrine in it. You may see that as well. You guys can read the rest of that column. There's not a whole lot more that I really think we need to say about that one. The photos of the products that you guys are seeing, I should give my local Walgreens, one of them, a shout out. They allowed me to come in and photograph these images. That was the first of a relationship I started to build with the local Walgreens, and they've been incredibly cool to me in providing me some kind of behind the scenes information and extra detail that ordinarily I wouldn't be privy to. So there's my endorsement for Walgreens. Diphenhydramine. Here's our Benadryl. Here's our TikTok challenge that we kicked the day off with. 25 to 50 milligrams is your usual dosage of this. It can come in a liquid or a pill form. Generally, it's an antihistamine, stop a runny nose. It can make people feel drowsy, so it's legitimately used sometimes as a sleep aid. If it's a sleep aid, you'll see it advertised. The product name will be like Nitol or Simonex or something like that. Sominex, I'm sorry. So let's say that a normal dosage is 2 pills. They're 25 milligrams a piece. 2 pills should stop your runny nose, should help you fall asleep. If you just take 10 pills, now you're probably going to have some hallucinations. Just outside of Laramie, many moons ago, there was a couple of college students that were involved in a fatal accident. They were responsible for the death of a fella coming back from his ranch, and they had intentionally overdosed on Benadryl. It wasn't the driver, but it was the passenger. When the state troopers were dealing with him, he was still suffering active hallucinations. Can only imagine what kind of trip that was after a fatal car crash. Probably wasn't real pleasant. Dimenhydrinate. I have heard this actually referred to on the street as dime. This is Dramamine or Unisom. That's the more common names we'll hear about it. 50 milligram normal dose. You take 5 or 6 of these pills rather than just the one. It's like poor man's acid. You're going to get some pretty cool psychedelics that when you come down, it's probably going to make you pretty nauseous and pretty sick. It's going to be a pretty miserable decline as you come down from a Unisom high. The legitimate use for that medication is for motion sickness. I see a lot of folks when I'm boarding airplanes start popping these pills right before we board. Whippets or air dusters. This is almost a standard punchline in every comedy movie made in the 90s. Huff the Ready Whip. So you have these. The difluoroethane is basically the chemical that's put into an aerosol projectant in those products like whipped cream and things like that, the Ready Whip. or the dust off that we spray the crumbs off your keyboard. You're huffing. So in a lot of ways, it's an awful lot like huffing paint or sniffing markers. Generally, this specific chemical is going to be in the aerosol propellants. And again, the whole idea is to kind of induce a sense of euphoria or encourage some kind of psychedelic effect. It's particularly dangerous when it gets into the body, however. The hypoxia that it can cause and the hyperkalemia, when you're messing with the ordinary exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen in the lungs, it can cause a whole host of problems that can occur in the lungs and into the brain. I don't think we ever want to start an exercise where we start ranking these in order of dangerousness, but if we did, I would definitely put that one toward the top of the list. And of course, we have nicotine. This is age restricted. Here in the state of South Dakota, not just anybody can roll in and buy cigarettes or chewing tobacco or vaping products, but I chose to include this in here because this is a drug and it can be bought over the counter without a prescription. And when it's intentionally misused, it can have some commercially unintended, undesirable side effects. I won't go into the vaping stuff too much, but if we can focus on that column under the drug science notes, in 27, I think it's actually now up to 28 different states have had people die as a result of using electronic nicotine delivery methods. In many of those instances, it wasn't nicotine that they were trying to get into their system. They were using other illicit drugs. I'm going to try very hard not to get onto my soapbox because there are certain products and certain marketing strategies that are particularly grating to me. And the way that the vaping products is one of them. Back in the day when these products first became commercially available, they were relatively expensive for what they were. And you had maybe the equivalent of 10 or 15 cigarettes in one vaping cartridge. And now if you're willing to spend a couple $100, you're getting over 1,500, sometimes 2,000, the equivalent of 1,500 or 2,000 cigarettes. So I'm not sure that the people who own Juul are real interested in the health of their consumers because they're certainly making it very easy for them to become chemically and psychologically addicted to their product. But it's not uncommon for these electronic delivery systems to be altered to be used as a mechanism to ingest other illicit drugs into the body. So I think it's kind of important to keep this on our radar. I also wanted to talk about the nicotine salts. That's not something that we typically see around here very often. Anything that comes from the nightshade plant family. Nightshade is a poisonous plant, by the way. Don't eat it. Don't put it on your garden salad. Keep your pets away from it. It does actually exist naturally in nature in South Dakota. Kind of uncommon, but it is a poisonous plant, and that's where these nicotine salts are derived. The salts are a concentrate of nicotine. So just like marijuana, if somebody was smoking raw marijuana flower or leaf, you have an unconcentrated degree of chemical potency. Nowadays, the stuff that I can run to a Rapid City bar and buy a dime bag of is probably going to be 12, 16% THC. If I wanted a concentrate of marijuana concentrate to dab, the waxing and that kind of stuff, or I went down to Colorado and I bought a tincture down there, you're looking at purities somewhere around 90%, 99% in some extreme cases. So the more concentrated, obviously, the more powerful the chemical is. And nicotine salts are a real deal, and they are a more powerful version of nicotine. So hopefully that makes sense. Phenibut, actually commercially for sale in Rapid City, South Dakota. It was one product, and judging from the amount of dust that I saw on top of the box, I don't think they're moving a whole bunch of it. This kind of, again, pushes me to an entirely different soapbox, but the Food and Drug Administration has very strict standards about what can be sold as a medicine or a food product in the country. If you have something that you claim has a health benefit, you're supposed to go through a very specific process with the FDA to get approval for commercial sale of that product. There are loopholes, there are enforcement limitations, there's a changing environment with marijuana coming on board and becoming lawful for many people in many states to use it under many circumstances. There's a lot of moving parts. It's a very complicated process. And if we had 6 weeks to talk about just that alone, I don't know that we'd have enough time. But Phenibut is one of a couple products that we're going to kick around here that kind of falls into this vague, unregulated, ambiguous kind of category. It's being promoted as a dietary supplement, supposed to be helpful for anxiety and insomnia. So if you're playing strictly by the letters of the FDA law and their rules, you should have your Phenibut product properly tested, and it should be approved through the FDA because you can prove that one, it's safe, and one, it does what you claim it can do. To my knowledge, Phenibut has never even been presented to the FDA. Now, I don't know that it hasn't, but to my knowledge and the research I've done, it hasn't. But its most common use when they can buy this alleged dietary supplement at some of these convenience stores or places that sell CBD and products like that. The folks that like alcohol, they like the effect of alcohol, will kind of double down and use Phenibut while they're drinking because it increases the amount of, or increases the degree of sensations that they observe when drinking. So if you like to get drunk, you take some Phenibut, and rather than drinking a 12-pack to feel a certain way, maybe you only have to have 3 or 4 beers. That's the whole idea behind the Phenibut and its intentional misuse. All right, so now we're on to Kava. I've seen this product a little bit more available in a couple places in the state. Again, it's promoted as a dietary supplement. It's specifically sold that way to try to distance itself from being a medicine.
Bill, just listen to Kylie. Do you have a question?
I have a question. When you are talking about like FDA approval process, so they regulate like food and drugs, but as far as like doctors administrating, they don't regulate any of that. So physicians will prescribe things for non-FDA approved or off-label drug uses. And I'm specifically referring to Prograf, which is an immunosuppression medication approved for like 4 or 5 organ transplants. But doctors will prescribe it for like lupus or rheumatoid arthritis and those types of things, even though FDA hasn't approved it. So is there kind of a slippery slope that they approve the medication itself, but then people prescribing it are able to prescribe it in ways other than what the FDA has said you can prescribe it for? Because in recent years, it's actually led to a drug shortage of the immunosuppression medications for transplant patients as well. Because when the government or, drug manufacturers produce it, they know the exact number of patients who have received, solid organ transplants in this country. So I'm just curious, kind of the view of physicians prescribing things that aren't approved for those uses and how it's different from some of the other things.
Here's the shortest answer to your question, which would be yes. It is a slippery slope. What you're describing, though, it is accurate. There are physicians who are allowed to prescribe non-FDA approved substances for legitimate treatment. That, however, in and of itself has its own process before they're permitted to do that. It's separate from FDA approval and FDA regulation, but there still is a process that those physicians are following to prescribe those legitimate medicines and drugs. Does that make sense?
Yes, yep. And then I assume that there's some oversight then as far as like collecting data then
Yep.
on effectiveness or things like that.
There is oversight that I can defend with documentation. This is my opinion that I can't defend, but I would say that that's actually better regulated than the stuff that is like a dietary supplement, or just imagine the pharmaceutical section at Walmart or Safeway, or Lynn's, depending on where you're at, and you're just walking down that aisle. I'm willing to bet that almost all of those products that you're going to see on both sides of that aisle have gone through proper FDA approval processes. Once they've gone through, really, unless there's a problem, there's not much regulation, oversight, or monitoring of those products. The ones that you're talking about that the physicians are prescribing prior to FDA approval, which is really where most of those drugs will end up, they'll end up FDA approved. There's a higher degree of oversight and a greater level of scrutiny and peer review primarily in those drugs as part of that process. But that's just my opinion. I don't think it's fair to me to, because I can't prove the FDA is rubber stamp something and now they ignore it and never pay attention. I don't think that exactly happens, but I think there's a higher level of scrutiny to the stuff that hasn't been FDA approved, but is in legitimate use for medical treatment.
That makes sense. Thank you for that information.
You're very welcome. That's a good point. All right. I've already semi-resisted stepping up on 2 soapboxes. With this one, I'm not even going to try to resist. Cannabidiol, CBD. Here is the quick, I'm trying to give us a common definition of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about CBD in this context for this presentation. You have a plant that grows in some form or fashion out of the ground or in a container that is marijuana. It is cannabis. Cannabis can be broken down into several different substances, and CBD is one of them. CBD is not the psychoactive ingredient or chemical in a marijuana plant, a cannabis plant, that is going to get you high. You're not going to feel warm and fuzzy. It's not going to make you run to the kitchen to grab your bag of Cheetos. It doesn't do that. It's supposed to have other healthful benefits. So it comes from marijuana, but it's not going to get you high. As defined by the 2018 United States Hemp Farm Bill, CBD is a marijuana cannabis product that contains less than 0.3% THC. So it doesn't have a lot of the psychoactive stuff in it. In its dry form, it can't have any more than 0.3% THC in it and still be called CBD. So in a perfect world where everyone is honest and conscientious and responsible, if I'm a manufacturer and distributor of a CBD product, it will never, ever in a million years have more than 0.3% THC content in it. All over the country, routinely, it's found that people will go into stores where CBD is sold. They will purchase these for consumer saleable products and have them tested, and they routinely have a much higher level of THC than what's allowed. So that's part of the problem with the CBD product. There's a National Guards person here in Rapid City who used CBD lotion on their hands, allegedly for a very specific reason to soothe an ailment that they had in their hands. They ultimately tested positive for THC on a drug screen. I cannot in a million years prove definitively that the only exposure this person had to THC was this CBD product, but the regulator who's responsible for those kinds of hot urine tests believed the story, because this is a soldier who's had a history of high performance and has never before had any substance use issues, and actually brought the product in to the guard regulator, the tester. Very open, very candid, very compelling argument. And I'm inclined to believe the soldier, based on what I've seen in many, many reports and many studies, that in CBD products, they do contain higher levels of THC. That's part of the problem with CBD. Here's, in my opinion, the bigger problem. In 2021, I believe it was March 22nd, the FDA released a media press release that contained the statement that to date, there has not been a single product presented to the FDA for their review or scrutiny, much less their approval, that suggests that any of the health benefits that are claimed by CBD producers and sellers actually has a legitimate healthful benefit. Having said that, I'm a big believer that often where you see the darkest smoke, there's commonly fire there. And because marijuana has already proven to have some legitimate medicinal purposes in effect, there are specific drugs that come from organic cannabis and then a synthetic version of it. Epidiolex, Marinol, Sativex, those are the only three to date that have received FDA approval. But if you have HIV or cancer and you're radically losing weight, you may benefit from Sativex. If you have a very specific seizure disorder, particularly among children, you may benefit from the medication of Epidiolex. And Marinol, I believe, is a sleep, an insomnia-inducing type drug. But there are three drugs that come from marijuana that are very legitimate. So the people in the CBD world that claim they have other healthful benefits may have something to it. But to date, there are no legitimate claims that these are proven safe and effective. So that's my soapbox about CBD. I think in many instances, it's snake oil. If you do just a random search online about CBD products, CBD will do just about everything but feed your dog and mow your yard. It's supposed to be helpful with cancer patients, resolving inflammation, sleep, mood, temperament. It just has not been proven to the standards that America demands for its medication and legitimate food and drug products.
There was actually a gentleman that came in and spoke maybe a year or two ago to one of the coalitions, and he actually works or owns a business that sells CBD. And he was even saying, you know, unless you find a bottle that has like a barcode on it where you can scan it and actually look up to see how much THC is in it, he's like, you have no idea, just as you were saying. And so, yeah, just kind of that word of caution that if you are looking to purchase it for any reason and it doesn't have that, you know, you should be able to do that and look up and see how much is in it. But like you said, I mean, if they can't even prove the benefits of it. But yeah, I just thought it was interesting. Even a person who works in a place that actually sells it was really putting out a caution about that, I guess is what I'm saying.
I think that there are legitimate ethical business people involved in this evolution of cannabis-based products, whether they're THC, CBD, or some other derivative, which is actually what we're getting into now. They want to do it properly, but there's an awful lot of folks that are trying to cash in early and often in this movement. And they don't want to do what's necessary because it's expensive and it's time consuming. And it's truly a case of caveat emptor, I mean, buyer beware. Sometimes the best you can hope for is that you're just wasting your money and it's actually not going to hurt you. But for products like Phenibut and Kava, there are documented deaths as a result of their use. Whether we're talking about the next topic, which is Delta-9 THC, or these other products, they're not being administered or observed by physicians in most cases. And all of us have our own unique health. What was really good for me may be incredibly detrimental to Dodie or Michelle. And what they need to do on a daily basis to be helpful either doesn't work for me, would have no impact, or would put me in the hospital. We're all very unique. And I mean, when you start introducing these chemicals, especially those that mess with the blood or the brain, you're running a great risk. And if the benefits can't be proven from a public health standpoint, a public wellness standpoint, as a preventionist, it doesn't make a lot of sense to endorse this stuff until it goes through the proper channels of approval and oversight. A couple of days ago, I'm on a website. I think it was delta8usa.com. This is a commercial website, as indicated by the .com. So I don't take anything very seriously from just one website that ends in .com. .com means they're there to make money. And ordinarily, I get great information from people that are selling these kinds of products. They want to tell you what they're going to do for you. They'll give you all sorts of background information, chemically, where do they come from, how they're made, and all that kind of stuff. This isn't the only website that I've seen that will say that in the state of South Dakota, you can buy Delta H marijuana or Delta 8 THC marijuana, and we'll ship it to you because it's legal. May or may not be actually accurate. Delta 8 is marijuana. If we think about having a bad day at work, and as soon as the workday is over, we're going to go down to the bar, we're going to have a couple of beers, and there's usually somebody down there that I can buy a joint from. If you're going to buy a joint in a South Dakota bar, 99.9% of the time, you're going to get Delta 9 marijuana. There are different, they're called chemobars or isomers. They're strains or types of marijuana plants. If you think of roses, there are many different kinds of roses, little small miniature ones to giant ones, different colors, different leaf configurations. They're still roses, but they're kind of different. Delta 8, Delta 9, Delta 10 marijuana, it's all marijuana, but it's like a different version of a rose. And like if we're going to drag on this sad analogy of comparing them to roses, you might have a regular set of red bouquet roses. Every time I screw up, I have to take them to my wife. They look a certain way. They're about yay big. They're usually red or white or whatever. And the leaves look a certain way. That's what I'm used to. Well, if I want to be different because I've really screwed up and went fishing and she didn't give me permission, maybe I'll try to get something special or unique for this specific instance. And now I buy these cute little miniature things. They're just different in their appearance. Same family, just a different strain. Delta 8 is kind of advertised as being like weed light or diet weed. I've heard one person refer to it of all the cool stuff of regular marijuana, but without the paranoia. There are some states when they drafted their laws that prohibited state use of marijuana. They were very specific in saying that it couldn't be Delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol. That is an illegal substance in the state of Missouri. You can't have it here. In the state of Wyoming, you can't have it here. Well, in a way, they kind of painted themselves into a corner by being overly specific and designated Delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol as the prohibited substance. So there are places like Delta8USA.com that are taking advantage of prosecuting attorneys and states' attorneys being reluctant to prosecute marijuana cases when they come across Delta 8 and Delta 10, because they're not the Delta 9 that was specifically enumerated in their state prohibition or laws. So the industry has said, well, if they're not prosecuting, it must be legal. That may or may not be the case. You're quickly seeing a few states rapidly present bills in their legislature to address these variants that they didn't intend to come in. So that's a moving target and an evolving process. But for purposes of this presentation, in Sioux Falls, I know there were places that you could go in and buy Delta 8. It's marijuana, it's weed, it's going to get you high, but it's supposed to be a less dramatic high than Delta 9 variant. Does that make sense? If it did, I'm kind of shocked because it's kind of a complicated issue and I very much worry I get way too far down a rabbit hole with that one. All right, that's the highlights for the over-the-counter drug stuff. I resisted a great temptation of including other things like double cupping, and because usually that's a prescription drug that's used with an over-the-counter drug. Suffice to say that there's all sorts of ways of intentionally misusing chemical substances, prescription or over-the-counter, that their intended use was never for the way that they're being used recreationally. I think the key for prevention specialists in our field, we treat this as a health issue. It's not a moral issue. It's not a legal issue. If we come from that approach with that kind of focus, it doesn't really matter what the state law is. When we have a young person or an adult in that moment of truth where they have to decide whether or not they're going to engage in this kind of risky behavior, we've given them the knowledge and the skills to make healthy choices. And really the rest of the stuff becomes moot at that point. Doesn't matter what the FDA does. It doesn't matter what state legislatures enact or don't enact. We have people making good decisions for their health and their well-being. With that, would you guys like a 10-minute break and I'll boot up the fentanyl one and we'll keep right on going? Do you guys have any questions first before we break on any of the over-the-counter stuff? All right. How about if we take 10 minutes and we'll reconvene at 1/2 the hour, be 9:30 my time, depending on where you're at. But at 1/2 the hour, we'll kick it off and we'll get going on fentanyl. All right, cool. Welcome back. Welcome back. We'll get right back into screen share here. Was the audio of that news clip in the first presentation okay?
There was a little bit of lagging on our end, but you could hear it just fine.
I asked because I've got another video on this one as well. If you guys aren't using Canva, Bella will tell you how awesome it is.
It is really great. A lot of good like templates and stuff to use.
It's just so much faster than PowerPoint, in my opinion. All right, so we're on to fentanyl. This section here sometimes has a little more impact when I'm presenting this in person because I pull out my smartphone and I usually pick a victim in the audience to watch what I type into the search field in Google. And I just type in South Dakota fentanyl. And it hasn't failed me yet that I don't have a news article that was released about fentanyl in the state of South Dakota that was released on that day. So again, I try to give people an idea of the size and scope of the issue in any of these presentations of what we're dealing with. I have some updated information that I'll show you in some subsequent slides, but I intentionally left these banners in this presentation for a couple of purposes. If you guys can just take me at my word until I can prove it to you that fentanyl is bad, then this will have a little bit more impact. The banner that has that reference to a Casper Wyoming Star Tribune news article from August 2nd of last year. 24 pounds of fentanyl is a ton of fentanyl. The potential damage, death, and destruction that quantity of fentanyl is capable of producing in our South Dakota communities is profound. That may wipe out pretty much the entire state. That particular drug seizure from the Wyoming Highway Patrol is pretty important because I happen to have a little bit of a relationship with some folks that worked on that case. And I learned that 24 pounds of fentanyl was headed to Sturgis for the bike rally. So that almost ended up on my back porch here in Rapid City. Also in that month, we had the Joint Task Force from Pennington County and Rapid City PD do a fairly sizable seizure on a long-term drug case that they had been working at 6,000 counterfeit fentanyl pills. I'll talk a little bit more about these pills, what they look like, and what exactly constitutes a counterfeit fentanyl pill as we get into this. 6,000 pills in a community of about 80,000 people. Had those not been seized, we would have had people, I guarantee you, we would have had people in the emergency room as a result of an overdose. And obviously, if you're getting that far, you're not that far away from death. My side of the state isn't the only one that's involved. Very routinely, I see some mention of Sioux Falls and seizures of fentanyl. It's happening just as consistently over there. All of us that have interstates running through or near our communities are going to be dealing with fentanyl. I left the last banner up there specifically because of the statement that they made in the article. And these 16 pounds of fentanyl that were seized at a port in San Francisco, that was enough fentanyl to wipe out the entire population of San Francisco 4 times. So 16 pounds, I wouldn't want to lug that around all day, but in the big scheme of things, that's not that heavy. That's not that much weight wise or volume wise, but that's the kind of the impact that fentanyl can have. Let's look at some more recent stuff here. So this is what we pulled up just a couple of days ago as I was trying to get prepared for you guys. We have the sentencing of the guy who gave the 16-year-old in Kansas the fentanyl. The 16-year-old didn't know that he was taking fentanyl. That's going to be a theme that we'll see several times in our discussion about this particular drug. It's kind of insidious the way that it's being used, and the deaths that are resulting as a result of fentanyl are cases where the person who is dying didn't sign on for this. They thought they were taking some other kind of drug. They thought they were getting marijuana. They thought they were getting methamphetamine. They thought they were getting heroin, but the drug dealers, for reasons that we'll describe here in a little bit, are lacing this with fentanyl, and they're getting much more bang for the buck than they ever intended. But again, this is just stuff that I saw just on May 17th. So, ongoing issue. Got folks all over in South Dakota that are being sentenced as a result of fentanyl. We've got the DEA issuing all sorts of alerts, public alerts and warnings. I've got a slide that I'll show you. Again, we're not going to beat you to death with data, but I'll show you a quick pictorial depiction of the scope of the fentanyl epidemic that we're dealing with here. I'll slow down a little bit like I'm talking underwater to give you just half a chance to kind of read through that slide there. That's an actual article that I took from Lexapol. It's primarily a law enforcement driven online magazine, borderline newspaper. I'm going to show you a video that's related to that article to kind of give you some fair warning. The video is not what I would consider to be like gross or graphic, but you are going to see an adult San Diego County deputy, a very healthy, very much alive, very capable, tough as I ever was, police officer be exposed to fentanyl, and you're going to see him through their body camera recordings actually have an overdose. He's going to fall over. He's going to look horrible to you. His eyes are going to be fixed. He's going to look like he's dead. I want to give you a little bit of forewarning just so you can kind of see what you're going to hear. But this is really probably the best advertisement for the dangers of fentanyl that I could share with you.
I'm San Diego County Sheriff Bill Elger. What you're about to see is dramatic body-worn camera footage involving one of our deputies who was exposed to fentanyl during his patrol shift.
You're okay. Don't be sorry. There's nothing to be sorry about. I got you, okay? I'm not gonna let you die. I'm not gonna let you die. It's okay. Just focus on your breathing, okay? Focus on it. I need Narcan! I'm Corporal Scott Crane from the San Diego County Sheriff's Department. My trainee was exposed to fentanyl and nearly died. It was our first radio call of the day, and this was Deputy Five Eyes radio call. He found a white substance that he suspected was drugs.
It's a powder.
It could be cocaine or fentanyl. It tested positive for fentanyl. This stuff's no joke. It is super dangerous. I was like, hey, dude, too close. You can't get that close to it. A couple seconds later, he took some steps back and he collapsed. I ran over to him and I grabbed him and he was ODing. And I went to my trunk, grabbed the Narcan, came down to him, grabbed him, and I did one nasal spray in one nostril, opened the other one, another nasal spray in the other one.
I remember just not feeling right, and then I fall back. And I don't remember anything after that.
Just breathe, buddy. Trying to get him to focus on just breathing. And because that fentanyl, you can't breathe.
It was in an instant. It's as though my lungs just locked up. I couldn't breathe. I was trying to gasp for breath, but I couldn't breathe at all.
Are you okay? Talk to me. Oh, no. Don't be sorry. You're okay. Don't be sorry. There's nothing to be sorry about. I got you, okay? I'm not gonna let you die. I'm not gonna let you die. I didn't know, Dad. I got you. I'm trying to not let him go. I wanted him to know he wasn't alone. It's invisible killer. He would have died in that parking lot if he was alone. Fire department got there, put him on the gurney. His eyes rolled back in his head, and he started to OD again. And he was ODing the whole way to the hospital.
I don't think people realize the severity of just how deadly it really is. I'm Deputy David Five-Eye, and I almost died of fentanyl overdose.
One of the greatest threats we currently face is the synthetic opioid fentanyl, which is 50 times more potent than heroin. Fentanyl overdoses are on the rise throughout our county. Every day, deputies recover fentanyl in our communities. And the county jails are not immune either to the dangers of this drug. Every week, sheriff's deputies intercept fentanyl entering our facilities. When inmates overdose on fentanyl smuggled into our jails, deputies and nurses are saving dozens of lives every month by administering naloxone, a medicine used to rapidly reverse the effects of the overdose. Fentanyl deaths in California have increased almost 46% in just the last year. Being exposed to just a few small grains of fentanyl could have deadly consequences. The dangers of fentanyl are real, and this drug is killing our communities. Please take the time to share this video. It might save the life of your son, daughter, friend, or a loved one.
Pretty heady stuff. There's a couple things that came out in that video that I've learned. I actually talked to the PIO for that particular agency, see if there was any more information they could release. Deputy Five-Eye is still doing very well. Obviously completed his training and functioning very well, but the PIO, the public information officer, shared a little bit more stuff that would suggest to me that this has made a long-term substantial impact on this deputy's life. And he's still sorting through his reaction to that event. So what had happened was they had a clear plastic baggie, a Ziploc baggie that had a white powdery substance in it. This is something that these guys come across on nearly a daily basis. They very quickly suspected that it could be some kind of illicit drug. They used a couple of field test kits. They first tested for cocaine and methamphetamine, used a separate kit using just a very small amount of the powder, put it in for the fentanyl test kit they were using. That's what caused the fentanyl to become airborne, and just the very fine, small particles that became airborne, he ingested through his nose, and it caused the overdose that you witnessed. So it doesn't take a whole lot of this stuff. I mean, it can be just enough that, it's so light and powdery, just a few grains that are light enough to become airborne were enough to put this deputy, who's as tough as I ever was, in that critical state. So I don't have the latest numbers. COVID kind of goofed up a few things for a few folks, including me, trying to get you more up-to-date numbers than 2015. I just want to quickly show you that the number of law enforcement counters for positive tested fentanyl are increasing. I can't prove it, but I bet $100 that we start seeing stuff from 2016, 2018, 2021. And those numbers have just come up. This is probably the more important graph. If we look down here for the total numbers of overdose deaths occurring, at the time that I put this slide together, the final numbers were just projected for total overdose deaths. We now know what that number is. The number probably is less important specifically than to see this ongoing trend year over year of total overdose deaths, which is the burgundy color bars. You have the total opioid related deaths, kind of the gray bar. And then in the blue bar, you have the synthetic opioid deaths, which would include fentanyl. Those also happen to be the uniform colors of the Colorado Avalanche. That was for your benefit, Dodie. Not the trending direction we'd like to see. This is a little bit anecdotal and I thought somewhat of a curiosity, but if you see the horizontal bar here on this graph, this is the time that COVID officially hit the shores of the United States. And we already see something that's trending upward in these overdoses. The colors are still the same, total overdose deaths, the opioid and then synthetic opioid deaths. They're all already trending upward, but they truly did spike as soon as COVID got here. And I think for a number of factors that all sorts of scholars could maybe elaborate on with a little more degree of scientific certainty than I'm capable of doing. So Sun Tzu said, if you're going to defeat your enemy, you have to know your enemy. So let's take a closer look at what this actually is and what we're actually dealing with. I put all sorts of little street names on there. This is pulled off of the internet. I personally have never heard of fentanyl being called anything other than fentanyl and poison on the street. China Girl typically relates to heroin. I've never heard that before related to fentanyl, but I saw 3 different sources that have typically proven to be fairly credible refer to fentanyl as China Girl. But that probably comes from the fact that a lot of heroin and a lot of fentanyl is being illicitly manufactured in China and then shipped to the United States to either come through the Western Seaboard, our port cities like San Francisco, LA, San Diego, or they'll come around through Mexico and cross our southern border, typically into Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California. Tijuana is a major entry point for fentanyl in the United States. That could be both Chinese and South American or Mexican manufactured fentanyl. Sorry about that. I'm going to go back 1 second to this slide. You heard the sheriff say that the fentanyl was 50 times more potent than heroin. Depending on testing, it can be up to 100 times more potent. Heroin has a higher degree of potency in its effect on the human body than morphine. I had a fairly substantial surgery when I was 39 years old at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester. As I'm in recovery and I'm kind of coming back to life, they gave me a little button that I could push that would inject a small amount of morphine into my IV. And I was able to do that, I think, every 15 minutes or something. I pushed the button one time, and honestly, I would have rather been dealing with the pain and discomfort from my surgery than that feeling of the morphine. Now you have morphine, and then heroin is even more potent than morphine. And now you have fentanyl that's 50 to 100 times more potent than the morphine that I personally experienced as a result of that surgery. I can't imagine what that would feel like. Little anecdotal addendum there. Again, trying to give you some idea of the size and the scope of what we're dealing with here. That little white object in the upper left-hand corner there is a grain of white rice, dried white rice. I've tried to pick an item that virtually everybody would have some kind of personal connection with. I think we've all seen or dealt with dried white rice, pretty small little item. If you divided that one single grain of white rice into 10 even pieces and ingested one of those pieces from that one grain of white rice, that should be enough to kill an average sized healthy adult. So lethal dose of fentanyl, 2 milligrams, average weight of 1 grain of white rice, 21 milligrams. And I weighed about 55,000 individual grains of rice, and then I got the average of 21 mil. I'm kidding. I didn't actually do the weight. I pulled this from the internet. So here's our family tree. Humanity has known for centuries that in addition to wooden shoes and windmills, over in Holland, they have some really cool opium. And if you consume that opium in a certain way, it's going to make you feel kind of funny. Some folks like that feeling, and now we're off and running with a recreational drug. Opium has been transplanted all over the globe. Certainly Holland wasn't the only place that it occurred naturally. But you have these poppy flowers, places like Turkey, other places in the Middle East. These things are abundant and they grow very well there. So from those poppies, we got Gen 1, that's opium, that's the OG of this particular opiate tree. Then you have morphine, which is derived from opium. Again, that's a naturally occurring substance, that's an opiate. And then from that, basically this chemical structure that we see on the left-hand side of the screen, if we rearrange some of those molecules in other configurations, we're basically using the same building blocks, but now synthetically we're rearranging them in a certain way. And the mad scientists that create all of the legitimate medicine that we benefited from may or may not hit or miss on whether or not they've got the best new mousetrap in pain relief or inflammation reduction or bringing the ability to sleep well. This is how medications are created. So the mad scientists went to work on morphine and came up with heroin and fentanyl. Heroin was a legitimate medicinal drug for a period of time. It worked very well. It was a great painkiller. The problem was it ended up killing a lot of people, so that doesn't make it all that viable for long-term medicinal use. So heroin isn't used. Fentanyl had a similar path to creation. Because it is now a synthetic, we don't call it an opiate, it's now an opioid. But it had a legitimate medical application. In fact, you can still prescribe fentanyl if you're a licensed medical practitioner. Some of the more common applications is they would infuse fentanyl into adhesive patches. And if you had like a back surgery with localized pain in the area of where the incisions were made or where the surgery work was done, they could attach these patches to the skin and they could slowly introduce this pain-killing fentanyl into the patient. Unfortunately, they found that even after FDA approval, the ongoing surveillance that they continued with this particular drug, they found that it's just untenable and that too many people were getting too many complications, and that included death. So that's kind of the evolution of fentanyl, where it came from and how it came to be. I don't know if I was trying to build some suspense with that dark black box in the lower right-hand corner with the question marks, but we've even evolved from the fentanyl that we're primarily discussing in this presentation. We'll go on to that. Here's the next greatest thing. A few of you, I happen to know that are listening in, get a end of the week update that I send out every Friday. It's news and resources and a lot of things related to prevention work in the state. A few weeks ago, I sent an update talking about this protonitsine. This isn't exactly new. It is kind of in the same family as fentanyl, but there had been a few folks that unfortunately had taken this particular drug, which is an opioid, and it's thought to be 3 times more potent than fentanyl. They took it unwittingly, and there were like 3 or 4 deaths, I think in Maryland and Virginia in the last few weeks. So it had gained some media attention, and I was getting quite a few calls and questions about what I knew about NITS. It had been around for quite a while. I've never professionally dealt with it. It was never part of any case that I was involved in. I knew it was out there, and I knew what it did. If you ever hear of nitazene or protonitazene or NITS, I think in one article I read, they were referring to it as proto. It's fentanyl on steroids. Here's the part that really is frightening. Even though it's part of that same family, it's resistant to naloxone or Narcan. And if I haven't scared you enough yet, here's the next evolution. And this is what I could have put in that black box with the 3 question marks. This is another isomer, another version, another strain, another evolution of fentanyl, and it's carfentanil. The only time that I've ever heard in the United States of carfentanil being used in a legitimate application was at the San Diego Zoo when they needed to dose a bull elephant for veterinary treatment. This is thought to be 100 times more potent than fentanyl. Keep in mind that fentanyl is 50 to 100 times more powerful than morphine. This stuff is just a nuclear bomb in a syringe. The good news is, to my knowledge, there hasn't been any carfentanil coming into South Dakota for illicit purposes that I'm aware of. At this point in our conversation this morning, it should be obvious to you guys that I certainly don't know everything. I may not even know much. So it is possible that carfentanil has been here or passed through our state, but to my knowledge, it's not being picked up by the people who distribute recreational drugs in South Dakota and unleashed on our communities. I think we would know very quickly if it did. So very quickly, here's how fentanyl and all of its derivatives are used or misused. In my experience, it's most often injected or snorted. Smoked is probably the most efficient way to get it into the body quickly, but it's generally injected or snorted. Fentanyl is kind of unique in that anybody can get on eBay or a site such as that and purchase at a fairly low cost a pill making machine that you can have delivered legally to your home or business, or an abandoned ranch that still has an address, which I know happens from time to time. You can buy a pill press. Then you can get a raw drug like fentanyl, and you can press that into a tablet form. If you've ever had a prescription or an over-the-counter pill that you just put into your pants pocket that you needed to take later in the day, and it kind of rode around in there for several hours, and when you pulled it out, it kind of looked, I don't know, furry or beat up. That's what a homemade counterfeit fentanyl pill will look like. It's not going to look smooth. It's going to look a little goofy. So as a general rule of thumb, I don't ever recommend anybody taking a pill that they don't exactly know what it really is, but certainly don't take a pill if it looks mangled or furry, because it could be a homemade version. And again, these pill making machines, these presses are commercially available. You can buy them brand new if you want to spend a few $1,000s on them, or you can spend a few $100 and buy a used one on eBay. Totally legal, totally allowable, and it totally happens all the time. But folks will get a large batch of fentanyl or other drugs, and they'll crush them up. They'll sometimes add other inert ingredients that in and of themselves aren't at all harmful to humans or other animals. And they will mix that with the more powerful drug like fentanyl. That increases the volume of the drugs that they're working with. And keep in mind, drug dealers primarily do what they do to make money. So if you can increase the volume of your product at very little to no extra cost, you're going to make more money when you're starting to sell it on the street, or you sell it to another drug distributor in another location, like maybe a smaller town. It would be really cool if we were all in person, because I would take over a whiteboard for a second and I would draw you the ugliest outline of the United States that you've ever seen. But then I would put an arrow down to where Mexico would be at the bottom of the shape of the United States. And I would say, let's pretend that we've got drugs coming in across our southern border, say at El Paso. These drugs were made in Ireland or Colombia or Xingu, China. For whatever reason, they're entering the United States at this point of entry. And let's just say this drug is fentanyl, and it's 99% pure fentanyl. And it would fit into a shoebox. That's a whole boatload of fentanyl. That's enough to do substantial damage, especially at 99% purity. Well, the original manufacturer of that substance may use a pill press and make little pills. They may put it into one giant block, like we've all seen on TV, how methamphetamine and cocaine are seized in large drug seizures. It may come across looking like that. The main point is it's a small box containing high purity drug. And in this example, it's fentanyl. I would then put a big star on the very southern tip of the outline of the United States, and I would ask you to pretend that that's really Houston. And that this drug, once it got into the United States, ended up in that major metropolitan area of Houston, and it was passed off and money was exchanged with somebody who distributes this drug in Houston. They're going to probably break these pills apart. They may put them back into pill form. Who knows? They're probably going to add these inactive inert ingredients to increase its volume and reduce the potency of the fentanyl. Let's just say, for the sake of easy math, they add what they add isn't important. They add something to it. And now, rather than just having a pound of this stuff, now they have 2 pounds. So we've gone from almost 100% purity to something that's about 50% pure. Now they hit a road trip and drive that 50% pure 2 pounds of fentanyl to Denver, give it to the next person in the chain here, our supply chain. They step on it, which is the term that they use on the street. They add their own inert ingredients. Now, rather than just 2 pounds of 50% pure, they double it again. Now we have 4 pounds of 25% purity. That then goes to Sioux Falls, and it's stepped on again. Now we have 8 pounds at 12% purity. That's roughly the purity that we're looking at in our heroin and the methamphetamine that we're seeing in the state. But they know that at 12% purity, you're killing everybody you're giving this fentanyl to. So they've got to step on it again here in Sioux Falls before it gets distributed to Huron and Redfield and Pine Ridge and Rapid City. So maybe you're getting something that's 3%, who knows? They're certainly not keeping close records, and they're certainly not doing accurate scientific measurements. But if you get something that's 1 to 3% purity, especially when it's involving fentanyl, and then you're very judicious in the application that you use when you sprinkle it on your weed before you smoke that joint, or you freebase it in your hot spoon, you're probably going to get high and you probably aren't going to die. But the problem comes in when the police end up doing a major raid in Denver, Colorado, in the middle of the supply chain, and everybody either ahead of that supply chain or that comes behind it is going to freak out, because they know in the drug trade that people like to tell the police or investigators where they were getting their drugs, because they don't want to spend the rest of their natural born life in prison. They don't want to lose their homes, their cars. They're going to cooperate in many instances. And that panic causes everybody on both sides of that person who just got ripped off to dump their stuff on the street. Sometimes they don't cut it again. Sometimes they don't add these active ingredients. So the sucky part is, if I'm a guy who just wants to have a weekend party, and I go to the guy that I've gotten my weed from in a bar in Rapid City for the last 10 years, and I've never had a problem, and he started to get drugs that are laced with fentanyl, I might buy the same amount of marijuana, expecting a very similar outcome that I've enjoyed for years from this particular guy, but now I'm getting something that I didn't sign on for. And you're getting people that are using the same kind of drugs or in the same amount, but because of this ripple in the supply chain, they end up in the emergency room or they end up dead. That happens all the time. In that banner that was second from the left on the second slide of this presentation, where I mentioned the Pennington County Rapid City Joint Drug Task Force, I read that article just like anybody else that lives in Rapid City could have read that article. And I smugly turned around and I looked at my daughter and I said, well, that means somebody's going to die. And a day later, I learned the same afternoon that I made that bold prediction, somebody was in the emergency room in Rapid City and did die as a result of a drug overdose. And that's a result of local drug dealers panicking and flooding the streets to get rid of that stuff. They don't want to flush it. You're not going to make any money doing that. You're not going to bury it in the landfill because you don't make any money doing that. You reduce your prices and you have a sidewalk sale or a blue light special, if you're old enough to remember Kmart doing that. You reduce the price and you pump it out as quick as you can and you cut your losses. But consequently, people end up dying. So
Bill,
whole process.
This might be a personal opinion then, again, I know it's, but what are your thoughts on the fentanyl strips then? Testing strips. You don't have to answer it if you just
No, I will.
Okay.
Because my answer is they're mixed. Because just like what you saw in the video with Deputy 5I and his field training officer, I think any reduction in doing the testing, that should be done in a lab setting. because I recognize how dangerous this stuff is and how unpredictable it is. It's kind of the same argument that I have with considering marijuana medication. You don't know its purity, there is no defined dose, and it isn't a guaranteed product that it's made the same way every time and it's repeatable. That raises the risk, in my opinion, through the roof. That said, I don't want deputies necessarily, if they think that they're dealing with fentanyl, do as little with that as possible, because you saw what could happen. That being said, I also have another foot in reality, and I understand that there are people that use drugs recreationally. Some of them have heartbreaking reasons why they do that, and I totally get it, and I am sympathetic to their suffering. If I'm going to be realistic about this, and I know that there are going to be people who will intentionally buy fentanyl and use it for an intended purpose, as long as I can explain the risk to them and try to get them to move to more appropriate treatment, that would be my first option. But I also know that people love their weed. They like meth. They're loyal to cocaine as well. And the reality of the world is they are unwittingly sometimes getting this other drug. I just assume that not anybody be testing for fentanyl. But if they're already going to be handling these substances, if they understand the risk to the degree that they're going to take advantage of fentanyl testing strips, then they're already at risk. So I personally support the idea of the providing fentanyl test strips anonymously. If it saves a life, that's fine. I don't think it encourages more use, specifically for people that are trying to test the quality of the fentanyl. Did I get the good stuff, man? These are people that are actually trying to save their own life, but they're already involved in risky behaviors that occur or are likely to continue to occur, whether they have the patch or the strips or not. So I personally think there's value in them. So I would prefer that we created an entire new legion of Americans and global citizens that just choose not to use the stuff at all. But fentanyl is kind of unique in that there are instances that I'm aware of. One actually occurred in a hospital setting. A guy used his mini fridge in Cheyenne, put his fentanyl patch in there so it would get frozen. Then he was able to cut it up, and he kind of used it like blotter acid while he was in the hospital. Thank God he was there, because he did OD. That's kind of a unique thing for fentanyl, because it does have a medical legitimate prescription application on those adhesive strips. So typically you don't find cocaine that comes in a form where you could do that. Sorry, I got excited. Again, I won't read this to you word for word. I'll slow down like I'm underwater and give you a chance to kind of browse through that. If you take any kind of common theme from what you're reading there, fentanyl is going to slow you down. Sometimes that's necessary for health and wellness under the prescription and observation of trained licensed medical staff. In a recreational or home application, very risky. It's not too tough to get the human body to slow down too much. And then I'm going to rail about pupillary constriction. And all of my EMT training and all of that stuff that I've gone through over the years, everybody likes to tell you what it does to the pupils of the eye. This is the most useless diagnostic tool that they ever could put out there. That's my opinion, by the way. Keep in mind
that's
that,
the first thing I look for, though, just so you know.
well, I know. I should be a better human being because I've been trained by incredibly talented instructors, and I failed in many areas, and using that as a diagnostic tool is one of them for sure. But often you see a combination. You've got polysubstance use going on, so you've got conflicting presenting symptomology, and I got a lot of limitations. That's what I'm telling you. The good news with a fentanyl overdose is you're not going to have to be a pharmacologist or a trained EMT. You're going to know that there's a problem. it's going to be very obvious. You guys saw Deputy Five Eye just tip over. That's a healthy, capable adult in good shape, and it just tea kettled him. You're going to recognize that there's a problem. It's very unlikely you're going to be in a gray area of, man, do we have something serious going on or not? So take some consolation. And if ever you have the misfortune of being in a circumstance where somebody is suffering from some kind of opioid or specifically fentanyl overdose, you're going to recognize you got a problem. And you're going to recognize that it's such a problem that you're going to have to call in the cavalry, a 911 call or something like that. Give you just an extra second to finish reading that. My guess is you guys have seen SPECT scans before. Here you have a healthy adult brain, upper left-hand corner. Here you have somebody who has been dealing with opioids or opiates addiction for a substantial period of time. The voids in this brain here represent the parts of the brain that are no longer functioning as a result of this particular chemical interaction in the brain. So you can see that that's a fairly profound effect. Kind of reorient you. This would be like the person looking at you. The eyeballs would be right here. So just take one example. Through modern medicine and research, we know that this prefrontal cortex in the front of the brain and the forehead, that's our executive function, our higher learning. That's the thing that will help Dodie process a situation the next time that we're teaching a class together and I'm walking down the hallway and I forgot to pull up my zipper. How does she deal with that? Does she make fun of me? Does she ignore it? Does she discreetly and politely in an unobtrusive way remind me that this is not acceptable social protocol to be walking around like that? That's some pretty high level thinking. And we do it all the time, usually without a great deal of consideration or appreciation for that process. Well, we see that in this long-term opiate user's brain, that may be that hole right there that would tell Dodie how to handle that. So she may do it in a very weird or awkward kind of way, or she may not even try to attempt to address that particular observation. We certainly know what these other parts of the brain are for, in large part, based on other studies. They're kind of barbaric in the way that they learn some of this stuff. You get a guy with an accidental injury and that part of the brain is damaged or removed. And now we see that he can't curl his left hand into a fist. Well, now we know that as a result of that arrow accidentally ending up in this person's brain right there, that part of the brain controls the left arm and its ability to curl into a fist. It's kind of how we learned a lot of this stuff and what these functions are for. But you would probably recognize that this person is suffering with some kind of health condition. That degree of brain damage and brain capacity loss is going to be pretty evident even to somebody outside of the medical or treatment field. Here's the good news specific to fentanyl. It doesn't have to be fatal. There is a powerful tool out there. You've already seen it in the Narcan or naloxone inhaler. In a couple of minutes, we'll even talk about how you get your hands on that stuff. When you notice this laundry list of things that look like it could be an overdose, an opioid overdose, if you have Narcan, which is the product name for the drug naloxone, on hand, one of those inhalers that you saw the deputies and the EMTs putting in Deputy Five Eye's nose, if you have that on hand and you inject that chemical into the nose of somebody who is suffering some other medical condition that isn't an opioid overdose, the good news is you're not going to do any additional harm or damage to that person. The only effect that it really has is to help save somebody's life who's having an opioid overdose. So in our fair state and in our communities, we have all sorts of protections in place for people who are righteously trying to do the right thing and save someone's life. So I personally would have no problem going to an ECHL hockey game, watching Rapid City play, and I'm standing there trying to get a sandwich at intermission, and I see somebody fall down next to me, and these are the symptoms or the observations that I could make of this person. If Narcan was available, at the Monument Event Center, just like it really should be. They have AEDs, they have CPR masks, they have portable fire extinguishers. They have all sorts of stuff that would fall under the category of emergency readiness. Really, I think if you're a facility that has those things, you probably should have Narcan on hand as well. That's my opinion, by the way. If I did see this and the person standing next to me at the concession stand and I had Narcan, I would have absolutely no momentary pause before I rip that package open and I administer Narcan. Because I know even if I'm wrong, I can't hurt them, which is most important to me, but follow very closely by, I know that I'm protected by Good Samaritan laws and that I have a very good reason because of my knowledge, my training, my experience, and now you guys have it as well. You understand the signs of what you're seeing. And it's a very logical reaction to use a substance that you know that even if you're wrong, isn't going to do any additional damage to this person. I have nothing to lose and that person has everything to gain if it indeed is an opioid related overdose. That's the star of the show right there. If you haven't seen it already, I bet you will shortly. Have they already seen the Avoid Opioid website as a result of SAPS training?
No.
Avoid Opioid SD. Go to that website. That's the state's Avoid Opioid statewide initiative. There is a ton of very helpful resources there, including lists of where folks, because this is open to this isn't for just preventionists, this is a statewide public intended website where anyone who is dealing with their own opioid related issues or they have loved ones, friends, family that are dealing with this, it's an incredibly useful tool full of resources and information for all of those folks. And it's very useful for those of us in the prevention field as well. One of the things that you're going to find there is a list of participating pharmacies all across South Dakota, which I hope to say is an ever expanding list. I know there are Rapid City pharmacies where you can get Narcan that aren't yet on that list, but suffice to say, there are a lot of places in South Dakota. Many of them are listed through that avoidopioidsd.com website where you can go and get naloxone or Narcan. My daughter had 2 wisdom teeth pulled several months ago, and her dentist prescribed her an opioid-based painkiller as a result of that oral surgery. When I went to pick up that prescription for my daughter, I asked for Narcan, and I was absolutely shocked that I didn't have to tell them who I was, didn't have to show extra ID, I didn't need a prescription. There was no fanfare, no bells or whistles. They simply threw the Narcan in the same bag as the opioid-based painkiller that they prescribed my daughter. Thankfully, my daughter didn't need it, never any issues. But if I had that stuff in my home, I wanted to have the antidote there as well. So this is readily accessible.
So did they run it through your insurance or did they just?
They threw it in the bag and didn't charge me for it.
Oh, awesome.
My suspicions are, and I can't prove this because I wanted to have the ability to walk out of there and smugly tell this story with kind of an air of sanctimony in my tone. So I didn't ask a lot of questions, but my suspicions are that Narcan, like an awful lot of other products they have there, they get like samples. So I suspect I was probably the beneficiary of such a circumstance, but they can run it through your insurance. My particular insurance, if I did have to pay for it, it would be a $5 deal. So I think there's also some,
because of the standing order in our state, like they'll run it through insurance, but if you don't have insurance and you can't afford it, then those that are participating in the standing order can run it through DSS and get reimbursed that way. I don't know if Shana wants to say anything more to that, but no. Okay.
the standing order that Michelle is talking about, at the very tip top of South Dakota's medical field, they issued what they were calling a standing order, which is just basically an ongoing directive to medical providers in the state that they have the ability to write a prescription for naloxone, and that the pharmacies have the ability to fill requests for naloxone without a prescription. in circumstances where folks request it. Most commonly, they're going to be like in my situation where an opioid has been prescribed, but you may have a family member who is using heroin or fentanyl or some other opioid. Maybe they're misusing other people's prescriptions, but opioid is the basis for their use disorder. I could, as a father or a husband or a brother, a loved one of another person, get my hands on Narcan through this standing order. And there's a great deal of better information on that website that probably will give you more detail and maybe a little more clarity than what I was able to just off the cuff explain to you there. But it's a very powerful, very important part of our state's initiative to address the needs of our folks that are currently dealing with an opioid use disorder or are right on the cusp as a result of a new prescription of maybe trying to avoid ever developing one. I try to leave everybody with good news after all of this doom and gloom. This presentation had a slide of a nuclear explosion, for Pete's sake, so maybe I can't bring it all the way back, but the good news is there are time-tested, ever-evolving treatment methods. Typically, the most successful are behavior therapies. There's some medication-assisted treatments as well, specific for opioid fentanyl dependency. They are wildly successful as long as you keep that term in its proper definition and perspective. It's a laborious, painful process, and like many other forms of substance use recovery, there's probably going to be failures, and it's going to be a start and stop several times. But if there's a commitment to stay to it, there are some treatment therapies that have a very well-proven track record of success. So I mention that because often, especially for loved ones dealing with family members that are in the grips of this, it kind of feels pretty doomy and gloomy, and that there is no hope. There really is never a time to give up on somebody. Hey, look at there. We've got some websites that might have been just mentioned. I'll leave this up here for you guys. Through DSS, Department of Health. Each of those places are sources of potentially very helpful opioid-related information for you. And I strongly encourage you, if you're in the prevention field, become familiar with the avoidopioidsd.com website. Because it's not, there's applications beyond just opioid, even though it's all there in that opioid portion of the state's resources. That should look familiar to you as well. You guys have any questions about fentanyl, heroin, methadone? Cool. Then that.
Think of kratom.
What do you think of freedom, they asked?
Kratom? Professionally or personally? Because I have two different answers.
Either.
Professionally, I believe it falls into the same category as CBD. There may be something to it, but it hasn't been proven to be safe and effective as advertised. I personally think it's snake oil. But when you have, maybe one of these days we'll all get back together and I'll show you a marijuana presentation that I've got. There's a slide in there that I think very accurately depicts my personal and professional opinion, not just about marijuana, but things like kratom and other drugs. I lost two of my brother-in-laws to muscular dystrophy. I watched them live in wheelchairs and be miserable and be in pain. I've lost family members to cancer in the slow, painful process. I don't really enjoy any degree of human suffering, and I'm all for making people feel better. And I'm all for quality and quantity of life. If marijuana or anything else that's out there can alleviate that human suffering, I am all for it. But I think we have to follow the rules and not accidentally do more damage than what was anticipated or intended. We have to follow the rules. That's my professional opinion. And the slide that I've got in that marijuana presentation is, why is this such a big deal? Is the question at the top of the slide. And why do people believe what they believe about marijuana-based products? And the first bullet I have is because it works. It does make the pain go away. It does do the other things. That's one possibility. Another possibility is they want it to work because they stand to make a lot of money, or that they've tied their own personal identity or reputation to the assertions they make that this stuff works. Or the other option, I don't know, without going too far down the rabbit hole, is that we just don't know enough at this point to determine what really is safe and effective. And I would put kratom and other items in that category as well. What really bothers me is that you could buy this, and if you believed it at face value, you could give it to your pets, you could give it to your children, and we really don't know its effect. And kratom is one of those that is known to have adverse reactions in humans. So, man, that's all you need to tell me, and I'm going to run the other way. But I'm obviously biased. I have to honestly admit that, in my opinion, and where I come from, and with my own personal health history. I mean, you guys have watched me drink a caffeine-free Diet Pepsi. I'm not a big fan of the sweetener that they put in there, but I try to actually be careful about what I put into my body, despite what my appearance is. I do try, but I wouldn't put kratom in it, and I certainly wouldn't give it to my dog.
You know, smarter approaches to marijuana, I think, really supports what you said, Bill, that, you know, they're open to the benefits marijuana could provide to somebody who needs it for chronic pain or sickness, but not obvious. Like you said, we need to do the research to make sure we're doing it to benefit and not do more harm, do it legally, not do it in, you know, different shops where you can get different levels of potency and not knowing what's in it and all those different things. So
I hope I don't live long enough to be in a world where we will legitimately call something you smoke medicine.
Right.
That just flies in the face of all logic and reason to me. But if you can derive a pill or a liquid from that plant that's past the level of scrutiny for efficacy and safety, then I'm all for a licensed practitioner with ongoing oversight of the administration of that. I mean, I'm all for it. But a lot of that is just my personal stance on it.
well, thank you very much, Bill. I found your presentation very interesting, and I feel like I'm pretty knowledgeable on this stuff, but I learned a lot from you today as well. You did a very nice job. So if there's more questions, certainly let us know. I'm going to put a note. I actually copied and pasted what Robin put into the chat box, the blue that help kind of for the signs of an overdose. So thank you for sharing that, Robin. So now I got to get back to my copy and paste my survey link here.